So I did some investigations, a bunch of pilot stuff before going to Kilimanjaro, because I had to figure out if I could collect EEG data outside. That's one of the big ones. And then I also had to figure out how not to get a brain injury at altitude. And that was a big one for me. And my preparation basically stems from these three concepts. I know nothing about altitude. I know nothing about Kilimanjaro. How do I do this? So I did some quick reading. This is not looking at the scientific literature. This is just Wikipedia and Google search for altitude. There's something called AMS, acute mountain sickness. Athletes typically get it. Young people get it. I'll probably get it. And so there are some suggestions they give, which is get lots of sleep before going, eat lots of red meat. Take an extra day to do it. Take some Diamox. It's a little drug. It helps you maintain some acidic levels in your body to keep your blood vessels open. And hike lots beforehand. This is the preparation advice. I didn't like that. Especially this part. Some people get AMS and I don't know why, or they don't know why. My science side suddenly went, bing! Oh, that's pretty cool. Something to look at. And then there are worse things than AMS, but AMS sounds pretty bad. What isn't on there is there's this headache associated with it too. But then there's something called HACE, his friend, high altitude cerebral edema. Now that kind of sounds bad. And so does HAPE, pulmonary edema. So these things we don't want. And then what about mild cognitive impairment? I didn't find much on that, particularly in the like in the tourist information. You can't open up a magazine about going to Up Rainier and read about MCI. So maybe there's some stuff around that. Maybe someone should talk about that. And then the questions are, okay, on the mountain, we know that people's brains do strange things. What's residual, and how long does it persist? The take-home message here is that this hypobaric hypoxia resulting from altitude could be bad, and it causes one's brain to malfunction. So this is good for research, but you want people to be healthy and okay. So, what's my role here is the question. So some weaknesses in the scientific literature is this, it's all about hypobaric experiments and people aren't actually hiking. Studies don't quantify behavior on the mountain. If someone's running around, jumping around, smoking a cigarette and having a glass of wine with every meal, they're probably going to experience something different than the guy who's moving very slowly, sitting in a chair, breathing deeply and very conscious of his body. And very little is said about protective behaviors at altitude. So right away I thought, hey, this is an area where a team and myself can really make an effect and change the lives of a lot of people potentially. So I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, a little more quickly. It's a competition here. The first time was a few months ago, and they'll have it again next year for those of you who are interested. It's how many times you can go up and down Mount Finlayson in 12 hours. And it's a pretty good competition. Now, White Mountain Peak is a summit we did after that, and purely the reason for going was to figure out what altitude was like, because I had never been there. And then, of course, there's the golden urn, I guess, Mount Kilimanjaro, which is what I'm preparing for here. So Finlayson Madness. It was a rainy day, very slippery, and you have a whole bunch of A-type personalities running up and down a mountain. This guy, he's showing he's done it 7 times, halfway through the day. And the goal here was to identify if I could actually collect EEG, or Megan could collect EEG in these conditions. Outside from a sweaty participant, that person being me. And I had this additional question, which I don't know if I told anyone about, but what happens when I drop my glucose down? Because I had this really simplistic model of, okay, oxygen, glucose, good scores on the task. And we found out, well, There's a picture of Megan playing with the emotive headset. She's putting things away actually at the end of the day, I think. And this is me when my glucose is low, and this is me when my glucose is high. And I don't have my task score data here, but I'll tell you right now that I didn't do well when my glucose was out of range. And just for your information, this is the number of summits completed on this competition histogram. This guy here, he did it 14 times, one person, in 12 hours. And my ego's hurting right here at 6 times because I had to collect data every time I went up the mountain. And I did it without eating the first 4 times. So we learned something. When my glucose is out, that's bad. We also learned that when we're doing these cognitive tasks, we need earplugs and we have to have people wearing warm clothes because it's really distracting if we don't. So the next little adventure here was White Mountain Peak. And this is where my movie career started. You'll notice there's a video camera at the back. I started recording everything. But the goal was to figure out what altitude is like. And this is a picture from the summit. We're way up there at near 4,000 meters. And I had an additional question. I just got this SpO2 meter in the mail. It measures peripheral hemoglobin oxygen saturation. Okay, so it's a measure of how much oxygen is in our blood and possibly available to our brain. And it looks like that. Very simple device. You also get your heart rate. I also brought a heart rate monitor as well on the trip. And I brought the emotive EEG equipment as well. And we played around here on White Mountain Peak was to go up the mountain, just drive down and see what it was like. So we actually went from sea level to 3,500 and nope, yeah. In 48 hours we went from sea level to about 4,000 meters. And that was interesting because we learned some things, some unexpected things. 2 of us made it to the top. One guy got sick and the other person was escorted the sick person down. And some lessons were learned here is that if I breathe the right way, I can keep my SpO2 high. If I move too quickly or get excited, my SpO2 drops very quickly, immediately. The average for our group was 84. What does 84 mean? I don't know. That's percentage saturation of our hemoglobin, and right now I can tell you mine's probably 98. The person who got sick was in the low 70s, and that was a dilemma for me because this is someone I know and they're getting sick and you're telling them that they should turn around, and short of grabbing a hold of them, punching them out and dragging them down, what do you do? So I just encouraged and encouraged because to me that was scary. He didn't look good. What we learned is normal breathing results in a low SpO2. This is what this gentleman was doing, who's in the 70s. Now, to add on top of that, when you're in the 70s, you get this altitude drunk where you don't listen to people anyway. And we had more questions after this. I indicated, what's a safe SpO2? I don't know. And what's the correct way to breathe? All the academic research that I could find always refers to altitude breathing as hyperventilating. And I think, right? That's hyperventilating. But that, I don't know, that doesn't make sense. So when I came back, literally, the day I got back, I looked and found as much as I could on the internet. I found this website that had this chart on there. And so, we're in here. My friend was in here. That's pretty bad. Total muscle paralysis and apparent unconsciousness. And then when you get to the death part, that's not fun. And then I looked at air pressure and altitude and what the human SpO2 is expected to be. 77% and 65% at the altitudes will be at Kilimanjaro. So that's in here. So did I mention that when I was in Ron's lab, he was doing research looking at anoxia and spatial navigation? Yeah, I was concerned. We'll skip ahead to Kilimanjaro. This is a sort of a topographical view of the mountain. Here's the summit right here at 5,895 meters. And we started up in the top left-hand side there, the Rongai Gate, right there. And we basically just followed the arrows that I put on the map. Okay? And each of these circles represents a place where we spent the night. And so this night 1, night 2, night 3, I collected data from the people I was with. Night 4 was the night before we did our summit. I didn't want to touch that. That's sacred. People needed to rest. We went to the summit. We left, rather, this camp at 6 in the morning, went to the summit, arrived just before sunset, and then came down to this camp for our 5th night at about 9 p.m. So 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. was our summit day. And then we walked all the way down here and then out of the park. It was quite an extraordinary adventure. Our 12 porters would haul up all of our gear, tents. You know, we'd have a dining tent, and then we'd have a tent like this to sleep in, 2 people to a tent. We'd have what they called a waiter who would bring us our meal. We had a cook, we had a guide, we had an assistant guide, and then we had the rest of the guys helping to move our equipment up. We were only allowed to carry 25 pounds of gear. And that's not a lot. And the reason is we've got to minimize the amount of work we do to maximize our retained oxygen levels. So this is near the summit, and our guide here, Deo, amazing person, very calm. So some preparation for Kilimanjaro, the science side anyway. We created a testing plan. This idea of measuring oxygen, the idea of measuring glucose, a digit span task, really simple, a balloon test of risk-taking to see if that changes as people go up. We of course brought the EEG equipment and we recorded it during the digit span task, and a double click paradigm that's actually used to look at schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. The idea is that there's some funny stuff going on between the timing of the thalamus and the cortex. And I thought, hey, that's a really good task for this particular situation because people have to count the clicks. They have their eyes closed, and so we have kind of eyes closed EEG, but we also have a real task associated with it too. So we can look at ERP and a bunch of things. And we brought a spatial maze that Ron's lab put together for this situation, a prototype maze for looking at potentially hippocampal function. And equipment. Well, there was a lot of equipment, plus my mountaineering gear. And I managed to put it all in 2 bags, a hockey bag and a small MEC waterproof duffel, and then my backpack. But the question is, who carries this? These guys were really great. They carried most of that. I kept the really sensitive equipment in my own backpack because I was paranoid. 2 laptops, a bunch of extra batteries. I didn't want anything to go wrong. It's a big investment. And on our way to Africa, we had to go through Seattle. We took the ferry out to Seattle, and the plan was the next day at noon to catch the plane. And on the morning, before catching the plane, we had breakfast with another mountaineer. She had recently gone up to the top of Rainier. And she explained how to breathe. More importantly, she explained something I'd never heard of, which was called rest stepping. So the breathing is like this. And if you do it at sea level, you get lightheaded. Okay, but if you do it at altitude as necessary, you feel amazing. Your oxygen levels stay high. Right now I'm feeling dizzy. And you do well. So there's something about the combination of the altitude you're at and the breathing style you're using that keeps you healthy. Now the second thing she showed us was rest stepping, and it's the idea of walking like this. So there's a step, and then a complete rest, and then a step, and a rest, and a step, and a rest. So each time I'm almost locking my knee on the back so that I'm just standing there. And it's amazing. You measure your SpO2 on a meter at altitude, and just the effect of walking that way keeps the numbers high. So we did go to altitude, and what I have here is sort of a bunch of measurements I took from day 2, a few on day 2, 1 on 3, some on 4, as we were walking, as the 4 of us were going up the mountain. And I, every once in a while, put the meter on someone's finger and get a measurement. And so what the green line here represents is the average SpO2 as we ascended to 4,586 meters. I didn't do any recording that I wrote down on summit day. That was sacred. That was also a dangerous place in my mind. So I left that alone for research, didn't touch it. But what we see is a general trend down in the peripheral hemoglobin saturation. And I don't have the scale marked, but this is essentially the trend in altitude, this red or brown line here. So we can see there's a little interaction there, which makes sense. Now, I've got a blue line there as well, and that's the average of just my 3 colleagues. I took myself out of the average because if we plot our individual SpO2 scores, I'm way up here at the top, and they're kind of down with each other. Okay, what I was doing was this crazy, ridiculous pressure breathing that I just showed you, and these guys were doing more kind of what their body wanted them to do. Okay, so this on Kilimanjaro is your typical tourist, mind you. And when the guides heard me breathing like I just showed you on day 2, they got concerned. This guy, something's wrong. He's crazy. I don't know what they were thinking, but the guide was really upset, and I had to explain what I was doing and the whole bit. So if I just look at my 3 colleagues here, and I can plot an average, we just see, you know, nice trend, decreasing SpO2. So all of the SpO2 blood oxygen saturation data that I could find in research always referred to, I believe, resting levels. Okay, so I plotted the average resting levels for each person during the ascent, and then compared it to what their resting level would be at sea level, at their home altitude. So you can see that, you know, they're kind of all in the same relative distribution there, and you know, they're down around, you know, 87, average 86, somewhere in there. That's resting. Now, if we compare it to their hiking SpO2 levels, look, they're down around 80. Okay. There's me, by the way. I threw myself in there just to make a comparison. Okay. That's me being paranoid. Pressure breathing. And so if I look at their average oxygen levels at camp for each of the nights, we can see that they're dropping, dropping. Now this night 6, this is 24 hours after the summit. And so it's at an altitude that's somewhat close to the first night. Okay, note that the oxygen levels are way up again. Okay, makes sense. If we look at the average digit span scores, we've kind of got some scores in the same relative area. You know, this is a small n. Okay, I recognize that, but we're about piloting this and figuring out where we might find something in a larger experiment. What we see 24 hours after summit is their digit span scores have dropped. What does that mean? I don't know. What does it mean? How long is that going to last? I don't know. It's a small n. That's all I can say about that. So what I did was, just for dramatic effect, collapse these three before summit, and then represent the summit as a single, point against a distribution, a really small, weak distribution. But the idea, the story is maybe there's something to say about that. So our result here for this pilot that we did was that, well, we can do it. We can go up to altitude and we can collect data. For example, one of the questions from the Ethics Approval Committee is, what if Dr. Zeman goes up and he's unable to collect data? Well, then I guess I'll stop, or the data will be really bad or something. But the truth is, I didn't know how I'd do. I didn't know, I didn't know if I'd get sick, if I'd get AMS or HAPE or HACE or what was going on, right? And I was fortunate enough to figure things out along the way about my oxygen levels and about breathing and my behavior from other people, that I was able to do some protective behaviors while I was up there. Now I know that there's room for this protective behavior stuff to be optimized, okay? Because I did some more reading and I found out that, of course, it's more complex than my simple model of oxygen in, glucose in, brain, and then task results. We also built some really great relationships with the people on Kilimanjaro and our guiding company and whatnot, so we definitely have an opportunity for future work there. But what's notable is not everyone adopts this protective behavior, and the reasons vary. And so I interviewed my colleagues, and they had various things to say about it, right? One of them being it just didn't feel right. Their body didn't seem to want it. Well, their body didn't know what was happening. Once they dropped to 70, they were drunk. One colleague, it was getting cold. His blood oxygen level was low. We knew this, but he wasn't putting on a jacket or anything. The porters actually dressed him. Right? So next time we do this, I need help. We need 3 people collecting data, because a 40-minute data session on 3 people for me at the end of the day hiking at altitude, we got to split it across to actually get a larger N. Okay. So come see me afterwards if this is something you're into. We need a better recruitment plan. Probably to work directly with the guiding company this time. They know us now, they know what we're about, they know who I am, so there's some trust there, so this could happen. What we learned is we need some graded neuropsych tests, particularly the spatial test, because everyone flunked the spatial test. It was a disaster. It's one of the early things to go, and I don't know what altitude it's going, but if the task instructions are a little bit complicated, and then the task on top of that, it's too hard. And graded neuropsych tests, I think, can help elsewhere as well for some of our other projects. So that's, again, something I'm keen on creating. And we also need to bring up a test of distractibility. That seemed to be one of the real features of altitude, particularly for one of the participants, was that just always distracted so easily. So my revised model here, as compared to my earlier one, I kind of started over here. What might have good task scores as an oxygen in, glucose in situation, but it's got to get to the brain. There's this nasty thing here called the body that gets in the way. And so we have to look at things like blood vessel dilation that actually interact with the residual CO2 in the body, it turns out, right? That's what this hyperventilating thing is about if you're at your home altitude, at sea level, right? What's happening is the blood vessels are starting to constrict in your brain, and you go and pass out. We've got to look at temperature. Are they warm? Are they cold? The amount of water content in their body, their hydration, and the hemoglobin serum ratio. We can measure how saturated their hemoglobin are, but we also have to know, how much hemoglobin there is in the first place. Okay, so one of the interesting things we found with the guides is, they were curious and they wanted to know what we were doing, so I handed the meter over, right? And their SpO2 levels were always lower, okay? But their performance, at least by observation, they seemed fine, okay? So they have adapted somehow. This ratio is very likely different. They've also probably got smaller distances between their capillaries and their cells and whatnot. These are things that I've read that eventually happen as you spend more time at altitude. And prior preparation. This is an interesting thing. I had one participant say that the reason he wasn't pressure breathing was because he got tired of doing it. His intercostal muscles, his diaphragm and whatnot hadn't been exercised. So, a type of training I'd recommend is, hey, hit the pool, go swimming, lots of swimming, right? Practice pushing water out, away from your body. And then the behavior at altitude is a really big one. The guides would walk like this, and this looks pretty efficient. But there's no pressure breathing, and there's no resting. So, I don't know what that means. I didn't do any research directly involving any of the guides, but there's an opportunity there to understand how they differ and how the tourists differ from them. And then, of course, there's, how much oxygen are you breathing in and what sort of nutrients you're taking in. For some reason, and I don't know what it is, you eat a lot, or you should be eating a lot, and like ravenous. It's pretty cool, actually. So measures for next time will be the stepping cycle, so that we know if people are actually rest stepping. Okay, so in one sense, a simple pedometer could help, but we actually want to know not how many steps they're taking, but how long they're relaxing. Right? Little engineering project. What's the physical effort being exerted? That's kind of the big question there. We're interested in the tissue and exhaled CO2 levels, of course the water body content, blood glucose levels, cerebral blood flow. This sort of I went through already. Moving forward, we've got a few things to do. We have a few projects on the go that are related to this. We've got to finish analyzing the data. We've got a little program that we're investigating for educating tourists before they go to altitude. Very simple idea. It's just a matter of getting them information that they believe and that they can apply. We're interested in understanding the subtle effects of protective altitude behavior. What sort of preparation should people be doing and what sort of training should they be doing. We want to investigate what factors affect the recovery afterwards. Okay, so let's assume you go up and let's assume there is mild cognitive impairment. What do you do to address that if it does happen? Okay, so there's a whole bunch of work coming out now about growing new neurons, neurogenesis in the hippocampus and the CA3, yada yada yada, associated with exercise. So should these people be on an exercise program before and after? Or is that a protective behavior and then one to encourage recovery? I don't know. We'll be up at White Mountain Peak again. You can literally almost drive to the top, so it's a great place for doing some simple experiments. For those of you who are interested in, creating temporary altitude lesions. So what I'm doing with my company is we're continuing to build algorithms that are sensitive to this. So, it's about detecting if Joe is changing, if his hippocampus is changing in some negative way. Or if there's some statistical deviation from his baseline. And finally, we just started an initiative with a clinic in town to pair up EEG and cognitive testing with their fitness program. Their fitness program is designed to address the issue of people getting really, really old and not, able to look after themselves, becoming frail.
Like over 40.
Apparently 40 is a good place to start. I've got 5 more years before I can participate anyway. So we have that going on. Are there any questions? No.